Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Been looking forward to this interview. We have on the program with us, the first hour, is Chip Ingram. If you go to our home, you will see lots of CD albums that come from Chip Ingram and Living on the Edge, and we certainly value his work over the years of preaching with a certain degree of conviction, but also with certainly a willingness to address these issues with compassion. And he has now taken on a whole series of issues we'll talk about today in his new book, Culture Shock, a biblical response to today's most divisive issues. And Chip Ingram, always a delight to have you on the program with us.
Oh, Kerby, thank you so much. It's a real joy to be with you.
I always enjoy being with you, and I might just mention for our listeners that we have information about the book. We have an article about it. We have the video that helps people know a little bit more about the study guide, and of course we have a web link to Living on the Edge. So as we get into some of these topics, certainly if you would like more information, we've made it very easy for you to connect up with Chip Ingram and his organization. Chip, I guess when we get into these controversial issues, I think there is a real tendency for a lot of people in the pastorate to address those issues maybe just in passing, or sometimes to ignore them. One of the things I love about you, and it's kind of been the philosophy here at Point of View, is nothing's off the table. If indeed there is an issue out there, we need to understand what God's Word has to say about that. And even if it's a controversial issue, that doesn't keep us from focusing on some of those issues.
Well, I think of, I'll poorly quote Martin Luther, who said, if we speak the Word of God on every issue except the pressing issues of our day, we deny Christ. And I think that, the issue is, how do you communicate those things with God's heart, and not out of anger, and not out of a syrupy compassion that, sort of wants to gloss over everything and make everyone feel wonderful, but that gentle balance that, of course, Jesus modeled perfectly, of holding the bar of righteousness with absolute integrity and high, and yet being compassionate as he dealt with people in the midst of their deepest sin. And I mean, that's our goal. Do it imperfectly, but that sure is our goal.
Well, certainly. And I might just also set the scene, because you actually are ministering in the San Francisco Bay Area. You were there for a while, then went to Atlanta, and now back again and at Venture Christian Church in San Jose. I was born in Berkeley, grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I know that area well. Sometimes when I fly into San Jose Airport going to Mount Herman, I'm well aware of how progressive that particular area is. So it might have been even easier for a Chip Ingram to say, this is a kind of a hotbed of liberal, progressive ideas. Maybe I don't really need to address issues like sexuality, homosexuality, abortion, the environment, even what the church should do. Maybe I just preach kind of maybe a truncated gospel. But again, I want to give high praise to you, and also the fact that you probably more than many pastors have had to really think through how to communicate a biblical message, both with biblical convictions as well as with biblical compassion.
Well, I've been in the Bay Area almost 20 years of ministry here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then on the other side of, we call it the other side of the hill, right on the coast, Santa Cruz, that thinks San Francisco is too far right. And so, I think what I think God put me here, because I'm not talking about these ideals or concepts. These are people in the homosexual lifestyle, some that have come out of the homosexual lifestyle. These are people that have had not one or two, but maybe 3 abortions. These are people that are hugging trees and are willing to lay down their life if they cut it down. And meeting and knowing and caring and not making these sort of like arguments that you have, but sitting down with real people and listening. Where did you get that idea? What makes that make sense? How do I communicate your dignity and that I respect you and I really want to hear has been the journey that I've been on. And then to be able to communicate clearly, okay, this is what God says, and let's look at our presuppositions instead of attacking our conclusions. And let me tell you where and why I'm coming from, and let's examine where and why you're coming from. But let's not just the Bible, but what does science say, and what's the medical community say? And I've just found, Kerby, when you do that and you actually care about the person. I mean, when I did the one, I'm sure it'll be the most controversial on homosexuality. I taught it at the church first, of course, and then we filmed it and did the rest. And I was walking, kind of getting ready 2 minutes before. I usually just hang out and see who's there. And a guy just stops me and goes, hey, I think this is really going to be an interesting topic for me. I pass out notes. And, it said the title of the message is, what do you say to a gay friend? I said, well, why is that? He goes, well, I've been in a homosexual lifestyle my whole life, and this is my friend, and he invited me to come. And we got talking a little bit, and I said, hey, would you do me a huge favor? It was just very, guy had really great people skills, and I said, you are going to listen to what I'm going to say like few people in the audience. When I get done, would you come up afterwards and give me an honest critique? You can't hurt my feelings. I've got to do this 2 more times tomorrow. And I never didn't know then it would be a book. But I said, would you do that? And so he did. And he came back down and he goes, man, you just blew me away by your introduction. I said, what's that? You apologized to the homosexual community, and you talked about how some people have bashed us and other people have just said everything we're doing is okay. But you really said, if you really love someone, you tell them the truth. But if you really love them, you tell them the truth in a very kind and loving way. And I said, well, did I represent? I tried to take as much information actually from people in the gay community or people who've been out of the lifestyle. And he goes, yeah, And then he said, I've been my whole life there. And then he talked about being abused as a child. Then he talked about, his drug journey and told me all of his life. And we got done talking, and this is the heart that I would hope would come through. And, I reached out to shake his hand, and I realized this guy walked into this church with a friend, and he gets blown away by, oh, my gosh, they're going to talk about homosexuality. I've been in the gay lifestyle all my life. And I realized he did not need a handshake. And I said, hey, can I give you a hug? And I gave him a big hug, and I just said, thanks for that honest feedback. And actually, don't have time to share it now, but it was interesting to watch what happened in that man's life and his spiritual journey and the turn that it took. I think because he heard the truth and realized we weren't any more down, and God's not more down on people struggling with homosexuality or fornicators or adulterers or liars or people logged on porn sites or drunkards or people with, drug addictions. And so it's really been an interesting journey that's been birthed out of a real lifestyle, Kerby, and that's my heart, that we would really share it lovingly.
Chip Ingram with us. We're going to take a break. His book is entitled Culture Shock. A little bit later in the book, he does talk about in his junior year in college, he felt like the Lord was telling him that this is a homosexual is going to come up and talk to you, and I want you to share your love with him, and did so, and has an interesting story there, and they're just full of facts, figures, statistics, but also anecdotes, and a biblical heart to not only express our biblical conviction, but to do it with biblical compassion. We come back, we're going to talk about a few of those issues in the book, Culture Shock. It is just out, and I would certainly encourage you to get a copy of the book. You can go to their website to find it. We also have it on our Point of View store, and if you can find it in your local bookstore, even better. Published by Baker Books, we're going to continue our conversation today as we talk about a biblical response to today's most divisive issues. Chip Ingram with us, and we have information about him, information about living on the edge, and certainly information about this book, Culture Shock, including a video, which I encourage you to watch. Maybe hit that share button, put it on your Facebook page, and share some of the ideas we're talking about today with others. We'll continue our conversation with Chip Ingram right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
You know, you don't have to be a sports fan to know that the NFL's policy concerning suspending players needs overhaul. There had been some debate about the 2-game suspension of Baltimore Ravens running back Ray Rice. He received that punishment for knocking out his fiancée and then dragging her unconscious body outside a casino elevator. There is no question he did it. The entire scene was caught on tape. Some of us might not really care about what the NFL does, but we have to realize that when a high-profile person, an athlete, an actor, or singer, physically abuses a woman and receives little punishment, it sends the wrong signal to society. That is why many said that a 2-game suspension is too light a punishment. Critics point out if he had been caught smoking marijuana, he might have been suspended for a season. As one wag put it, that's the equivalent of knocking out 8 women. Another critic pointed to a player who was accused of getting free tattoos from his college and faced a 5-game suspension. Even other critics wondered what the punishment might be if he had been caught on camera making a derogatory comment about homosexuals. The NFL can say that it does not condone its players being physically abusive to women. Of course, that could be said of every business or corporation in America. But actions speak louder than words. A 2-game suspension sends the message that physical abuse isn't a big issue. Apparently, there wasn't even a specific NFL policy dealing with suspensions for physical abuse. There was a policy, of course, for drug abuse. It doesn't matter if you're a fan of football or not. The NFL is probably the most visible sports business in the country. What the NFL commissioner and the NFL owners do reverberates through society. When players who make their living in a violent sport bring that same mindset to society, we should pay attention. And when the NFL gives a physically abusive player a 2-game suspension, we should be concerned and ask the NFL to reconsider. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Chip Ingram with us today as we talk about his book, Culture Shock, a biblical response to today's most divisive issues, published by Baker Books. And certainly as you go through here, you'll have a number of chapters, sections on read for yourself, as well as the opportunity to take some of these ideas and use them in your Bible fellowship, your small group. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Chip, just before we get into some of the issues, I was struck by how influential Francis Schaeffer was in your life. He certainly was influential in the forming of Probe Ministries, and certainly in my life. I learned a little bit more about how you took some of the writings by Francis Schaeffer and wrote a thesis about it, but you even have a section on read for yourself, because a lot of people probably wonder, how did we get here? How did we move from a time in which we believe in absolutes, the family that you grew up in you use as an example, to a time where we believe that all truth is relative, it's personal, it's situational. And that change is one of the reasons why these issues are even more contentious than they were a few decades ago.
It really is. In fact, if people could understand that we all have these glasses that we put on and we look through and listen to issues, and the glasses that most people are putting on are radically different. I mean, radically different. If we went back 100, 120 years ago, yes, these glasses would be dark. No one would even give a second thought to. So you're telling me that gravity is it's sometimes but not other times, that it's right to, all this relative thinking really has transformed, how we look at everything. And for me, I found myself in grad school, and I'd become a Christian. I was growing, and but I wasn't going to throw my brains in the trash, and everything I believed was being challenged. And so I ended up reading literally everything Francis Schaeffer wrote. And I thought, well, if this is really true, I'm going to test it. And in a secular school, I was doing my master's, so I wrote my thesis on the is the ethical issue of, is there an absolute truth or not? And then I just got pounded by 4 PhDs about could truth be relative or absolute? And I remember defending it in about a 3-hour conference and having Dr. Phelps, who was at the time, turn to Dr. Ostro and say, Dr. Ostro, you're just digging a bigger and bigger hole. Because all I did was exactly what Francis Schaeffer did, was keep moving him back to his presuppositions, where he said, no, you can't say that there's an absolute truth. I said, well, what if someone, this was back in if it feels good, do it, and, you have your truth, and I have my truth, and everyone's truth is equally. I said, well, what if someone's truth is to walk in, shoot your wife and your 3 kids, and they felt good about doing it? Well, that's preposterous. That violates. Now, wait a minute. Says who? Who makes you the moral judge? How intolerant of you if that man wants to do that? And he said, well, you're just making up stories. I said, no, Dr. Ostro, here's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we all draw a line in real life. We all live by absolutes. But what we do is on moral and philosophical issues, we say there isn't any, and then we create what we like, and then we move from there. And the fact of the matter is no one lives consistently with that. And a lot of actually this book is taking that approach lovingly and even with my homosexual friend to say, if you honestly believe that you're born gay, then it's your identity, therefore it's who you are, and if you're really made that way, then everything about homosexuality is normal and natural, and since it's normal and natural, you're made this way, then it is a civil rights issue, and if anyone, Christian or not, tells you that what you're doing is wrong, if in fact you're born this way, you should be livid, angry, mad, and protest. And which is, okay, that's the presupposition. However, if in fact there's no scientific evidence, no clear studies anywhere that say you're born that way, it's not who you are. It may be shaped by environment. At best, maybe some predisposition toward same-sex attraction, like people have it for alcohol or heterosexual attraction. Then it's not who you are. Therefore, it's choices and environments that you have to deal with. Now we have a whole different story. But that begins a dialogue rather than an argument.
Yes, very, very well done. You just talked a minute ago about the remarkable changes over the last few decades, and your chapter on human sexuality, in particular the issue of premarital sex and cohabitation, you have a graph which is just startling because you show that back in the 1950s, about 5% of girls and about 10% of the boys were sexually active. Now you get up to 70% of the girls and 80% of the boys from 1950 to 2000, just a straight line going up. And when you look at cohabitation, premarital sex, you can see that the world has changed dramatically. And a lot of that is due to the fact that there's no longer a line. There's no longer an absolute truth. It is you do what you think is best for you, or to use a biblical phrase, everybody did what they thought was right in their own eyes.
Yeah, and I guess what I would say, too, there may be, and I hope there is, because lots and lots of people listen to your show, and some just like the controversy, and others really just love getting experience where I'm at. I know every weekend, whenever I'm speaking, I know I have people in the lifestyle, homosexuality. I know I have scores of people that are currently living together who say, I love God, and, I really like what's happening here, and I love Jesus, but, I'm going to keep living with this person, or I'm going to stay in this lifestyle. And I think what you say is that it is astounding that we've come to a point where we can sort of live in these dichotomized lives where all of Scripture becomes a salad bar where we pick and choose and decide what we'll obey, what we won't obey, and unfortunately with devastating consequences. And so I would say to those listening in the gay lifestyle, the book addresses heterosexual sins, because I think often I've heard people pound away on the homosexual issue and almost give a pass to in evangelical Bible churches today. And this is Survey, Barna, etc. So you hope it's wrong. Okay, that's all I can say. I pray like this is the most skewed study he's ever done.
Yeah.
But it's like 30 to 34% of 18 to 30-year-olds are currently living together or having casual sex.
And you see that too many other places. The Lifeway study, it's the same thing. Go ahead. Yeah.
And so And so, this book isn't about how do we, put a hard finger on people that believe in, pro-life or homosexuality. We're trying to, the biblical view, God's protection, God's love is being violated. Well, of people who live together after 10 years, whether they get married or don't get married, and only I think it's maybe 60% of them eventually get married. 10 years later, if you live together, only 1 out of 10 of those couples are still together.
Yeah.
How can I not tell them, don't do that? That's not, God cares about you. This is not about, let's get those rules and hammer people into place. This is, you are missing. There's pain. There's dysfunction. The wages of sin is death or separation. And so that's God's heart. Those commands are for our good.
Yes. We've done some programs on cohabitation. Of course, we've done a number on homosexuality and a variety of other issues. And we can remember back in the days, I'll take you back now to Dallas Seminary, when Howard Hendricks was saying, fooling around on the porch, you're going to mess up your house. And the idea that premarital sex, cohabitation are bad for you. Well, now, Chip, one of the things you find is that secular social scientists, people that could not possibly sign the doctrinal statement of your church or the church of many of our listeners, people at Rutgers University and all sorts of institutions, but I'm thinking in particular the Marriage Project, are all pointing to the very same thing, and that is the best evidence they have, as you just pointed out, is that if you live together before marriage, you're going to harm your future marriage and all sorts of other issues that are surfacing. So it isn't that we Christians are trying to hold on to some biblical truth, even in the face of opposition from the secular world. If you really look at the data, the secular world, if it's wanting to be honest, is really affirming some of those biblical principles. And I think that's just another very strong argument for the authority of the Bible.
Absolutely. And, on a different topic, because, I think and I don't want to switch topics if it's not time to switch topics, but I think one of the things we should own is when we're really off, we ought to own our stuff and just live up to it.
Right.
And I think the fact is that here's what the people in our church, one of my very best friends is living with his girlfriend right now. We are super tight. We hang out together. We play golf together. I've pleaded with him. I've showed him studies, and it's me. And he's these aren't just intellectual issues. He is overwhelmed by fear. He's got some past history. He's scared, on and on. But he's on a pathway that's going to bring a lot of pain.
That's right.
And I love him. And so, but part of what I think we need to do is own, okay, we are not living the life in some of these core areas, and we wonder why people outside of Christ are not interested in the gospel.
Well, I agree. I've said before that, you go on college campuses today and evangelism is virtually stalled, and you see in our culture, and I think it's pretty obvious because, as we'll say when we come back from the break, there are very good studies, even one Probe Ministries did with Barna, showing that the Christians live pretty much like the non-Christians, and so college students looking at Christians say, well, really aren't any different. And in one survey, we found that when you ask non-Christians, what's the difference between a Christian and non-Christian, the non-Christian oftentimes said, well, Christians go to more meetings. And if that's the only difference, we're in a bad way. So we're going to take a break and come back and continue our conversation today with Chip Ingram, Culture Shock, and a biblical response to today's most divisive issues. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation with him and you right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. Chip Ingram with us as we talk about his book, Culture Shocks. Dr. Tony Evans, pastor of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship. I spoke at his church last night, by the way. Founder and president of the Urban Alternative, says in Culture Shock, Chip Ingram delivers a calm, purposeful, biblical approach to the hot-button issues of our day. For pastors, teachers, and laypersons, this book will smooth the rough edges on the controversial topics plaguing your church, a book that we highly recommend. Do encourage you to find out more about it. Just a minute, we'll also talk about how this could be a very helpful book for discussion in a small group or a Bible fellowship. But let's take a phone call to start the conversation today, and we'll go to North Carolina first. WLGP. Andrea, you're on with Chip Ingram.
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me?
I certainly can.
Thank you. I was privileged to be at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill between 1971 and 1975, and I was a baby Christian, and it's close to my heart, Genesis and Time and Space, the God who is there, He is not silent, Labrie, all of Dr. Schaefer's teachings. I was a naive, more than naive young woman, and I even had a friend. I led a Bible study at that time, and I remember her name just like it was yesterday, was engaged to a guy. Her name was Dixie. She was engaged to a guy, found out he had the homosexual lifestyle. She was devastated. They separated. I really like what I guess I'm sharing, Kerby and Mr. Ingram, is I believe our culture today is very similar to 40 years ago. Very similar in that we are paying attention to image and politics and power. And there is a hunger for truth. Oh, yes, there is. But I believe that we're devoid of spiritual teaching and foundation and biblical truth, and that is why the church is so much needed. And that is what I wanted to hear your comment on. And I really think we're very much like we were in the 70s. I mean, I feel like I'm living in Morehead City, Carteret County, and I can't tell you how people have turned deaf ears to spiritual truth. I want to hear your comment on that. Thank you.
You know, there is a quote that is attributed to Abraham Lincoln. I'm not sure he ever said it, but nevertheless, he supposedly said that the philosophy of the classroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of the government in the next. And certainly we can see that the philosophy of the classrooms in the 1960s and 70s have been kind of the philosophy of the culture. So, Chip, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think what was experimental and radical is now normalized. When you do think about it, the people that were being radicalized are now the parents and the people in power.
Yes.
And I guess part of my passion to write this book, and then when we saw it, realized to put on DVD, maybe is I'm going to get on the solution side, is if I'm a mom or a dad, a pastor, a small group leader, an elder, deacon, a grandma, a grandpa, if you passively think, boy, things are really bad, I just don't know where they're going to go, and isn't this disturbing, Uncle Fred? Well, it sure is, Aunt Ethel. There will be no change whatsoever.
Right.
You need to sit down and read this book or something like it, or watch this DVD in your living room with your preteens and your teenagers, and sit down with your college student and say, I know this is a really big issue. Let's talk about this as a family. This is a dad out with his son or a mom out with her daughter. This is a whole high school group saying, we need to know what the Bible says, and we need to know how to communicate this on our campuses in a clear and loving way. And just what our caller said, I don't think change is going to happen by us getting up in arms, because she's right. The thinking of the 70s is now the norms of the next millennium.
Certainly. Since you mentioned that, let's talk about some of the resources. We do, of course, have your video up here. It's just kind of a preview that gives people an idea. But then we have a link to Living on the Edge, or people can go directly to livingontheedge.org. You have all sorts of resources, not to mention your previous books, but even this new book, which they can purchase there. But you also talked about the DVD, the study guides, and the rest. Talk about how people that are listening right now that might want to use that in their church, their small group, their Bible fellowship, how they can do so.
Well, we've had the small group DVD out for about a year, and I just actually got an email from someone that was super encouraging. But so literally hundreds of churches have used that here in the States and around the world. And you know, it's captured really well. And then the study guide provides a lot of extra things, so you can kind of take notes. By September 1, we'll have all of that actually digitally, so you can, you know, the next generation that doesn't want to order a DVD and stick it in a player can put it on their iPad and share it with people all over. But I think the thing is, you got to dialogue about these things. You need to listen. And the bibliography, I remember spending 2 days in a little room checking. I mean, we went back to all the original sources, and because what we know is that all you need is one source where you quote someone who quotes someone, and we found some bad ones, some statistics where people were claiming outrageous things, and actually some of the statistics were accurate, but we were quoting someone who quoted someone, and we got back to the origin, and you just found out, man, that guy's a nutcase. If people check that out. So I want people to know we've checked our sources carefully. There's lots of debate and a lot of people, you know, throwing things out. So you need to go something that's credible. So it's a small group resource that we found really helps people, and I would just encourage, especially the younger we start, the better. And so college on down, young professionals on down. Not that it's not good for any class, but people probably 45 and up are going, I don't know what's happening to the world, and people 35 and down going, you know, what's the problem? I'm actually most concerned about the entire evangelical church, 35 and down, Kerby, with the revisionist movement, where we're seeing a complete shifting of what the biblical text says on homosexuality. And that's not going to stop unless, you know, we lovingly say this is what the text says. To me, homosexuality, abortion, most of these issues are, you know, that picture that we have of the iceberg and 10% is above the water. All of those, to me, are really nothing more than symptoms. Underneath the waterline is hermeneutics. How do we approach Scripture? How do we take the authority of God's Word, and how do we read it like we would read any other book in a historical, grammatical, this is the author's intent. And I think what we see is when that shifts, the fruit above the waterline is homosexuality or abortion or living together, and so the issues are deeper, but we got to start somewhere.
And in the bibliography, I appreciate you quoting Kerby Anderson on homosex theology and Sue Boland on answers to questions most asked by gay identifying youth. And you're also aware of the fact that some of the studies we've done show that the younger you are, the less likely you are to believe that homosexuality is wrong, the more likely you are to accept it as an alternative lifestyle. So certainly there are some very important issues to address. And before we get too far, I wanted to at least mention one or two other chapters, because I don't want people to think your book is only about human sexuality and homosexuality. So let's talk about the environment for just a minute. And you start out with something that I paid attention to when I was growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I participated as a teenager in the first Earth Day. But when I got my environmental handbook as a person who had just become a Christian, I realized that this man, Lynn White at UCLA, said the reason we're having the environmental crisis is due to the Christians, because they believe that you are to subdue the earth. And I think that was a wrong reading. We are to have dominion. We're to be stewards. But the environmental issue is one that's also been foreign to the church. I remember studies that have shown that interest in the environment and church attendance are inversely related. In other words, the more likely you are to go to church, the less likely you are to be in the environment. Interested in the environment. It seems to me as Christians, we should be good stewards of God's creation. Your thoughts?
I couldn't agree more, and I would say this is one of those areas where we ought to stand up and, quote, be men and say, we as the Church of Jesus Christ in the area and environment, by and large, have blown it, and blown it big time. We have we've taught bad theology, or by our omission and practice, acted like the environment doesn't matter, and categorized people that are very environmentally sensitive as wackos, tree huggers, etc., etc. Now, it's very clear the earth is not my mother, okay? I'm not a pantheist. There's not, a worm, a beaver, a dog, and a human don't have all equal rights because they are, quote, animals. But with that said, God gave us the stewardship of this planet. The people that should be the most environmentally sensitive are followers of Jesus. The water, the air, appropriately, when you mine things, what does it do? Replacing forests. Recycling. I even got down to the point where, as I was studying all this, I was so convicted. I thought, how many gallons of water have I wasted because I like to hear the water running when I shave? That sounds like a crazy little thing.
Yeah.
But here's what I've come to in my whole life, Kerby. If I don't act on the little things, I will never act on the big things.
That's good.
I want to be environmentally sensitive everywhere.
We're going to take a break. We'll get into a few more issues, but we'll also take some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Chip Ingram with us. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Chip Ingram with us for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. The book is entitled Culture Shock, a biblical response to today's most divisive issues. Talked about the endorsement by Tony Evans. Jim Daly, president of Focus on the Family, says, is it possible to articulate timeless biblical truth without resorting to anger and argument? It is possible, and that is something that I think you can find in this book, and I certainly do commend it to you. Let's go back to the phones. We'll go to the state of Maine this time, WBCI. Sandy, thank you for calling today.
Hi. I just want to commend you for putting this out there because a lot of churches don't put this out there. it's not something that you hear talked about a lot.
True.
And I think we need to know how to defend ourselves when, being a Christian, people attack you. This is the first issue that's brought up.
Sure. And I certainly want to come to you, Chip, because I know that, as I said before, you have kind of a philosophy that we need to address all sorts of issues. And I do want to give you high commendations for some of the articles that you've put together, books you've put together, certainly some of the CDs and radio programs I've had a chance to listen to. You really do resonate with the younger generation, not to mention your own generation, our generation. And I think part of that is because nothing's off the table. You're willing to take the Bible into every area of life and say what you believe God's Word says about that particular issue. And so I think that is testimony to the great work that you've been doing all these years through Living on the Edge.
Well, thanks so much, Kerby. Honestly, I didn't grow up as a Christian, and so probably a lot of it has been,
yeah.
How can you not talk about these things? I have very little courage, but I'm afraid not to obey. How's that?
That's a good one. Well, and again, I live in this world where I'm on college campuses. I'm doing secular radio. I'm doing Christian radio. I'm interacting with people of all sorts of different stripes and situations. And I find myself sometimes in a church service saying, okay, that was a great message, but okay, how does that apply to life? I mean, and I'm really good at application. When I've taught sometimes as an adjunct professor at Dallas Seminary, I'm kind of the so what professor, the application guy. And after I hear a sermon, I'm going, okay, what do I do with this? I mean, a great message. I have not a clue how to apply it to my daily life. Which brings me to another question one of our listeners was asking. I'll just ask hers since she couldn't stay with us. And that is, how do you make this kind of real in your life? How do you really encapsulate that? And I was thinking in your chapter on politics, you have a whole section here about live the life. In Acts 2, the early church in action, you see people that were praying, devoting their life to preaching and teaching. They model life devoted to Christ. It seems to me that this cannot just be head knowledge, as you said. It's got to be heart knowledge. And we really need to live out the Christian life before the watching world, if I can borrow another phrase from Francis Schaeffer, because the watching world is looking at us and saying, I don't see any difference. You Christians don't look any different, so I'm not buying. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would say there's a reason why when we tried to figure out, people kept asking us, so living on the edge, what exactly do you do? Well, is it this or is it that? And yeah, we create some small group stuff, and there's radio, TV, and this, but we just came to, what? Our mission is simple, to help Christians live like Christians. When a Christian lives like a Christian, and by the way, that's not perfect. That means when you mess up, you own it, you apologize. That means that, but you live out your faith. And I think the point is that the world is just desperate to see that. What the early church, they weren't smarter, they didn't have technology, but they were winsomely living out what they believed. And what we know, in fact, in our day, I mean, if you want to take your hat off to a methodology, I would say a generation and a half ago, the communists radically believed, and 2/3 of the world became communists because they were willing to live out their faith. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it was false. I think you see, 1%, maybe 2% of the entire population that were passionate about the homosexual agenda, and look what has happened in the last 30 or 40 years. God has always had a people that it's been unpopular who have this radical balance of loving people like crazy, standing for the truth, and paying a very high price that has always changed the course of history. I can't think of a better time to do that than now.
Yes. In your chapter on politics, we mentioned that just in passing, but we're in an election year, and on the one hand, we don't want to be so extremist that we are convinced that by electing this candidate, we're going to bring in the second coming. But on the other hand, we don't want to be so isolationist that we don't have a responsibility. And in that chapter, you talk about the fact we have a dual citizenship, and so we don't want to be so heavenly minded, we're no earthly good, but we don't be so politically minded, we're no heavenly good. There is a sense in which we should exercise stewardship responsibility. In this election year, I would encourage our listeners to pay attention to the candidates, do their research, vote intelligently, because I believe God will hold us accountable for the stewardship of even the vote that God has given to us in this country.
I agree 100%, and I think just as people are, quote, as you hear, disillusioned with the institutional church, they're even more disillusioned with the government.
Yes.
And it creates this passivity. It's, oh, what I do won't really matter, and the fact of the matter is nothing could be farther from the truth. And so as individuals, we need to be great citizens who know the issues, know exactly what the Scripture, what is truth, and vote accordingly, whether that's Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Independent, whoever. But you got to take a stand. And then in the church, I think what we need to do is not allow the left or the right to co-opt our message, and where the banner over the church becomes, some big moral or political issue as opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Again, the book deals with all sorts of issues: human sexuality, homosexuality, abortion, the environment, politics, but also very important questions. How did we get into this mess, and where do we go from here? It is impossible, even in an hour interview, to cover 250 pages in the book, but we certainly do commend it to you. And Chip, just before we end, let's once again talk about the resources that you have available at your website, because I would encourage people not only to get a copy of the book, but to get all the small group material and to seriously consider about using this as a way to educate themselves and people in their Bible fellowship about these important topics.
Well, I'll start from maybe people with the most influence and try to rapidly go down. If I was a pastor and I thought, I should address this, if you go to our website, you could download the MP3s or get the CDs, the videos, whatever, but you can go where it says message notes, and you can click on that for free, download them, you can use them. Change the name, it's by you. I mean, copy it right, okay? I'm glad that, but all the sermon notes are there. They're for free. If I was a small group leader, I would say, or a youth leader, college, young professional, or a Sunday school person, I would say, we should address these and be able to articulate it. I would do the small group DVD. And then if you're just personally thinking, I need to get a handle on this, my brother just came out and he's a homosexual, or, I've got a tough situation on my college campus, or I just need to get educated. I think the book is probably the best resource because you have the bibliography, and if you're like me, you dig in and you underline. So, you can go to the website at livingontheedge.org, and you can sample, you can look, you can test, and our heart's desire is to serve people and help them get educated toward action. I like you're the how-to guy. I love that because I think that's my passion as well, Kerby. If people read this book and nod and go, yeah, and don't do anything, I will cry. That is not the goal.
That is not the goal. We just appreciate so much, Chip, the things that you have done over the years, and we followed your career, and will continue to invite you on this program anytime we can. And this is a book that certainly fits very well into the sweet spot of what we do here at Point of View, addressing many of these issues from a biblical point of view. We're dedicated to helping you articulate a biblical worldview, and also dedicated to helping you defend a biblical worldview. So whether it's worldview, apologetics, or many other topics, those are things that we address. And Chip Ingram, this has been a great book, and we count it a privilege to interview you and look forward to the next opportunity we can do so.
Well, it's mutual, and you mentioned it a couple times, but I downloaded all your research on all these things, and it was super helpful to have someone take all the best surveys and look through, all the biases that they normally have and give us what I thought was some of the very best information. So thank you for serving us.
Well, thank you. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into another issue. But again, don't forget the book Culture Shock, a wonderful opportunity for you to look at a biblical response to today's most divisive issues. So I really do encourage you to get a copy of that. You can find it at our website, pointofview.net. We've got a video there that you can follow, and maybe even hit the share button and put it on your Facebook page. We also, of course, have information about the book, and of course a link to livingontheedge.org. All of it's available at our website. I hope you'll take the time to take advantage of those resources, and as you do so, I hope that you'll also remember that we are a listener-supported program, and if you can help us out financially, we would appreciate that too. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time today talking about what I call a pronoun problem. I've talked about this before. Sometimes when we talk about how we can be involved, sometimes people will say, well, what can I do? And I say, no, it's a pronoun problem. It's what can we do? How can we be involved? And that is certainly true in terms of marriage. What can I get out of my marriage? No, it is Team US, Team Us, U and S. That is the important part, because, again, your marriage should be a team effort. And so we certainly encourage you over this next hour to listen and maybe apply some of these principles as we talk about this book, Team Us, Marriage Together. Ashleigh Slater is with us, and she is the author of the book. A writer and editor, very passionate, by the way, about seeing marriage as every stage of life really thriving. She is the founder and editor of the popular webzine Ungrind, a regular contributor at Start Marriage Right and www.ibelieve.com, The Time Warp Wife and For the Family. We have information about this book, information about her, and an opportunity for you to get a copy of the book, as well as a link to her website. So, Ashleigh, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby. I'm glad to be here.
You start out with telling the story about you and Ted, so we've got to tell that story. It is hilarious, and it kind of gets us into the Team Us that you are talking about.
Right. It's funny because I first met Ted when I was a full-time graduate student and I was working full-time. So I don't actually remember the first time that I met him. I wish I did. You know, had I known I was going to marry him, I probably would have taken more notes of him in that first introduction. But as we kind of got to know each other, he asked me out to lunch, and we say it was our kind of first date because we were kind of feeling out the waters and seeing, okay, you know, should we date, should we not? And at one point during this lunch, he was terribly nervous. He kept, eating pieces of cucumber salad, so we still laugh about cucumber salad because he ate so much of it that day. But he looked across the table at me and said, you know, our singles pastor said I should just marry you.
Just love that. Not the way you start your first date, but anyway, go for it. Yeah.
No, and he laughs at that now and says, you know, I don't recommend, you know, saying that, you know, so early on, but we still laugh about that, and I actually took it really well at that point because he was so nervous. I felt so calm. It's funny because I've just come to know he has a very dry, kind of witty sense of humor like that, and I've come to really appreciate that about him, and we still, like I said, laugh that he would actually say that.
Yes, well, a word to all the men listening right now, this is not a good pickup line, okay?
Yes.
But anyway, it's the way it began. One of the things I love about the book is even though you write it, there are little times when we have Ted says, you know, Ted gets to interject a few ideas along the way. But let's kind of set the stage because we're going to talk about the idea of teamwork in marriage. That, in some respects, should be intuitively obvious, but in this culture where people tend to be a little more self-focused, especially with the high rates of narcissism, and maybe not necessarily always having a good role model that they came from, trying to understand that marriage is a team is a concept that really does need to be focused on.
Yes, I agree, and I don't think it's this natural inclination for us because, I mean, we're all selfish, you know, and I think that our society and culture doesn't help because we're very much, you know, me, you know, even now the current generation is a me generation. You know, what's in it for me? How is this going to make me happy?
But it really is this thing of when you walk down that aisle, sure, you're a me, you're a him and a her, and you get to the end and you say your vows, and when you go back down that aisle, you're an us. That doesn't mean you don't still have individual likes or preferences, but you are willing to die to some of those and give in to some of those for the overall benefit of your team. And I think that that's so important.
I might just mention this book is published by Moody Publishers. You probably can find it in your local bookstore. We've made it very easy for you to find as well on our website, and we give you a link to Ashleigh's website. We also have a video that you can watch, and so that will give you a chance to get to know her a little bit better. We encourage you on all of these videos to watch it, then maybe click the share button, send it maybe to your Facebook page or podcast or something like that so that you can educate others about this. But again, look for the bookstore in your book in the local bookstore, but also, of course, we have a way in which you can get it from her website. You talk about early on in the book that neither you or Ted are really kind of sports fans, but yet you use the team analogy. You said he's probably more likely to watch a reaction to the president's speech on Fox News than to watch a clip on ESPN. But still, the team concept, whether you're sports-oriented or not, is a very important concept, which is foundational to your book, is it not?
It is. And like you said, neither one of us really likes sports, although Ted will tell you he wishes he does because, that would make it easier for him to jump into conversations about basketball and football with, buddies. But, I think that, even if you go away from sports, say you look at a team in an office, like a business team, or you look at a show like The Amazing Race, where you have teams that are racing against each other. When you look at the teams that are successful and do well, it's because they are working together and for each other. Usually the teams that are bickering and fighting over every little thing, letting it divide them, aren't as successful because they really lose sight of this goal of, playing for a winning season. And I think as couples, we can become really distracted by little things that we let divide us and keep us from really having the unity that I think God wants and intended for marriage. And so I think just keeping this idea of, we're in this together for the benefit of the team is so important to marriage.
Well, and you also alluded to the next thing that I think is a foundational issue in your book, and that is the idea of grace. And I love where Ted talks about a quote from R.C. Sproul Jr., who explores kind of the idea that if you want to look at 1 Peter 4:8, probably a better translation is, when we are wronged, our calling is to practice a careful moral calculus. Is this one offense that I should let go of, or is this offense grievous enough that love means confronting in grace my brother? It seems to me that sometimes you have to figure out in a marriage what is an issue that is of major importance, an issue, a hill to die on, versus whether or not, in light of eternity, whether this big issue right now is really that big.
Yes, and I think that you have to even step back and look at it. I know that I have to look at it and go, okay, is this even a sin issue? Because, I get irritated by things Ted does, and I have to step back and go, okay, if this is not a sin issue, then maybe it's a me issue, and I need to just get over it. Maybe I'm the one that needs to change. And then if it is a sin issue, I think that there's a point where you probably should talk about most things if it's negatively impacting your relationship in some aspect. But sometimes if it's a littler thing that's not a huge deal, I think we can choose to overlook it and maybe talk about it later when it's a better opportunity, instead of making it this bigger than it is. Because I have seen couples who are fighting over socks on the floor, which is not, I don't think that's a sin issue, first of all. That's just maybe a habit that could use some improvement. But they're choosing to fight over things like socks. And Ted and I, he just chooses not to look at the bottom of our closet, since I tend to be the one who leaves clothes there. And we end up giving each other a lot of grace.
That is really good. It's also a principle that we'll talk about. We pick our battles and how we extend grace. We'll talk more right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
You know, you don't have to be a sports fan to know that the NFL's policy concerning suspending players needs overhaul. There had been some debate about the 2-game suspension of Baltimore Ravens running back Ray Rice. He received that punishment for knocking out his fiancée and then dragging her unconscious body outside a casino elevator. There is no question he did it. The entire scene was caught on tape. Some of us might not really care about what the NFL does, but we have to realize that when a high-profile person, an athlete, an actor, or singer, physically abuses a woman and receives little punishment, it sends the wrong signal to society. That is why many said that a 2-game suspension is too light a punishment. Critics point out if he had been caught smoking marijuana, he might have been suspended for a season. As one wag put it, that's the equivalent of knocking out 8 women. Another critic pointed to a player who was accused of getting free tattoos from his college and faced a 5-game suspension. Even other critics wondered what the punishment might be if he had been caught on camera making a derogatory comment about homosexuals. The NFL can say that it does not condone its players being physically abusive to women. Of course, that could be said of every business or corporation in America. But actions speak louder than words. A 2-game suspension sends the message that physical abuse isn't a big issue. Apparently, there wasn't even a specific NFL policy dealing with suspensions for physical abuse. There was a policy, of course, for drug abuse. It doesn't matter if you're a fan of football or not. The NFL is probably the most visible sports business in the country. What the NFL commissioner and the NFL owners do reverberates through society. When players who make their living in a violent sport bring that same mindset to society, we should pay attention. And when the NFL gives a physically abusive player a 2-game suspension, we should be concerned and ask the NFL to reconsider. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Ashleigh Slater with us today as we talk about Team Us, Marriage Together. It is published by Moody Press, and we have a link to her website, Ashleigh Slater. And if you don't know how to spell it, that's why we have it linked on our website today. And you have a whole section here. I mentioned a minute ago about this idea of pick your battles, certainly have a realistic view of ourselves, sandwich our criticism. And that brings us into this section on when it is time to really make an issue out of it. First of all, I think you've warned us that sometimes these issues that seem so large are really pretty minor. If you give it a day, sometimes you'll forget why you were even upset about it. But there are times when we really have to address the issue. There is something that is either a sin issue or it's something that might really get the marriage off track. Talk about how we then, as a team, us, address those issues of criticism.
Right. Well, I think it really, a big thing is how we actually communicate about those issues with our spouse. I found that for, Ted and me, if there's an issue, if I'm seeing some sort of sin in his life that we need to talk about, I can come to him and in a very humble manner, not a proud manner, not come to him and say, you know what, you are doing that, and you shouldn't be doing that, and you need to change. Instead, say we have had, I talk about in the book, we've had some time management issues in our marriage. Just a matter of him, coming home late and me being like, wait a minute, where's our time together? And having to talk to him about that, because before we were married, him having this really weird schedule was not sinful. It was not a bad thing, but once we got married, it really started to take a toll on our relationship, and in some ways could come across as him just not being very thoughtful of me. And so when we had to actually talk about the issue of how he was managing his time, instead of me coming to him and saying, you need to change, I could come to him and say, you know what, I feel like such and such. And then I think that really helps him not be defensive, and it puts the emphasis on me. And I can also come and say, you know, I know that I struggle with this and I need to work on it. Well, could you work on this? So one, I'm not putting him on the defensive, and I'm coming very humbly. And also, I think that we can, you mentioned, you know, sandwich our criticism. And what that basically means is that when we do have some sort of issue, such as with Ted, his time management, I can come to him and I can sandwich that criticism with praise, kind of like you would put bread, ham, and bread.
Right.
So I can give him some praise and say, hey, you know what? I love to spend time with you. You know, you're such a great guy. We have so much fun together. Really affirm him, and then say, but, you know, this is getting in the way of that. And how can we figure out a way that you can manage your time in a way that is good for our relationship? And then come back and say, you know what, I'm really looking forward to spending time with you. So I think when we affirm, that really helps our spouse not be on the defensive. And when we make it about us and our feelings rather than them and how they need to change, and just come very humbly, I think those things make a huge difference when you actually do have to address something.
I might just mention in your chapter, each one of the chapters, since we're talking about chapter 2, you have a section called Us Time, in which you have a series of questions, and you encourage people to read over those questions, find some time to chat with your spouse about some of those habits, and so that can be a very constructive way as well. So each one of your chapters has some Ted Says and some areas where you can maybe have some conversation. So I think people will find it very helpful. But let's keep moving, because you have a chapter there on yours, mine, and ours. And it is amazing to me over the years, Ashleigh, how as I look at all sorts of couples, it's almost like the truism, opposites attract. But then when they get in marriage, they attack. And so sometimes the differences that I think are important in terms of the complementarity of a marriage oftentimes are very different, and you might have very significant differences and interest, but you talk about how we build a common interest, we don't force change where it doesn't matter, we learn to stretch. Talk about that, because right now some couples are really having marital problems because the differences that sort of attracted them are now a major source of conflict. And yet if they choose to work through those and find some areas of commonality, their marriage will be stronger, won't it?
It will. And the thing is, I think they can find a lot of joy in that, too. I mean, it may not seem like it when you think about it. One of the things you mentioned was, stretching yourself. And for Ted and I, that has really come down to, for example, when we got married, I was like, I don't like Thai food and I don't like sushi, and you can like them all you want, but I'm not going to eat them. And I hit a point in our marriage where I was like, you know what? Maybe I should try them, because I think I don't like them because I've had, Thai food once or twice. I've never had sushi, but, raw fish just doesn't appeal to me. But he loves them. So maybe I can, Ted likes to say, share in his joy. Stretch myself, step out of my comfort zone, and, try the food that he likes. And, the worst that can happen is I still don't like them, which is not the case. I ended up loving them. But, the worst that can happen when you step out of your comfort zone and try something that your spouse likes just because they like it is you find out, okay, I don't like it, but I think that you've improved your relationship just by showing them that you are willing to give it a try. And the best thing that can happen is you go, oh, wait a minute, I do like that, and all of a sudden you have another common shared interest. And I think that continuing, you come to marriage with some common interest. I mean, as opposite as you are, something drew you together. There are things you like to do together, and that's great. Keep maintaining those.
Yeah, for you it was music, wasn't it?
Yes. I started out writing music reviews, and he's a musician, so that really helped bring us together. But I think that, one of the main points of the book is, be intentional about growing together daily with your spouse. And I think that when you are being intentional to cultivate new shared interests, you're going to continue to grow together, rather than if you keep pursuing a lot of different interests. I mean, you can have some different interests, but if that's all you're pursuing, then you're going to grow apart, and you're not going to, you're going to say, hey, I'm going to go out with my girlfriends tonight and tomorrow night because they like what I like and you don't. So let's just, pursue our own things. So I think that, really stretching yourself and stepping out of your comfort zone is so, so important. At least it has been in our marriage.
The title of the book, Team Us, A Marriage Together. Ashleigh Slater with us, and we're working our way through it. It's published by Moody Press. Look for it in your local bookstore. And just before we take a break, let's get into a chapter where you talk about Conflict 101. And I love the fact that even though you're younger than some of our older audience, you also love the I Love Lucy program. And you found it hilarious until you got married, and then things seemed to change.
Yes, I grew up watching Lucy because my mom loves Lucy. So I really grew up watching, old movies and I Love Lucy, and my mom and sisters and I, we would laugh hysterically. And then, like you said, I got married and I watched it and I was like, oh my goodness, how in the world does their marriage work? Because in the real world, you would be divorced by now if you were constantly pulling these pranks on each other. And so I had a really difficult time finding the humor in it. I really couldn't talk because I had my own conflict issues and wanting to avoid it. With time, I came to not be so serious about I Love Lucy. I came to see, okay, you know what? It is a comedy. I'm not basing my marriage on it, and I can laugh at it and learn from it even. Okay, that's not what to do. Don't do that in my marriage. So it's a fun show once again for me.
Yeah, but again, you talk about Ms. Denial and Mr. Discussion, and of course, I guess you sometimes refer to yourself as a chatty Cathy self, so I guess obviously, but there are times when sometimes the communication is the problem and the conflict, is it not?
Yes, and for me, it was very much the issue of not communicating when we hit conflict, because I really hated conflict, so much to the point that I would avoid it at all costs. I would internally try to deal with it, not bring it up, and, a few days later, I would feel better and pretend like everything was normal. Of course, I was not really dealing with it. It was still in there, and it would resurface later. And my husband, Ted, was very much like, you know what? We just need to work through conflict, because conflict's not bad, so let's address this. And he always knew when I was upset, even if I pretended like I wasn't. So we really came into marriage with very different perspectives on conflict and how to deal with it. And I would say that I'm the one that has had to grow the most in that area. It's once again an issue of stepping out of my comfort zone, which was to avoid conflict because it is uncomfortable, and realizing that if we looked at conflict almost like an adventure, because, adventures have ups and downs. They're not all like, yay, woo, I'm so happy. If I looked at it as an adventure that once Ted and I came through to the other side together, we were stronger and our relationship was stronger, conflict just kind of took on a new definition for me. And I saw it as something that, yes, is uncomfortable, but working it out is ultimately good because it benefits the long-term health of our relationship.
Team Us, Marriage Together. The book is published by Moody, and you can look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have links to Ashleigh Slater's website and a video that you can watch that will give you a great overview. Let's take a break, and as we move along, perhaps you have a comment or question, 1-800-351-1212.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Ashleigh Slater with us. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Like to know what works in your marriage? How have you resolved conflict? What about this idea of developing teamwork? The book, again, is entitled Team Us, Marriage Together. And if you'd like to join us, we'd love to hear your comments. 1-800-351-1212. You know, Ashleigh, we were talking about conflict resolution. And I remember years ago, we did an interview on this program, and I've talked about it many times before, of research that was done at the University of Denver, in which they found that there were sort of 4 characteristics that were oftentimes leading to disillusion, maybe even divorce. And they said that even as they watched couples before they got married, they could predict the success of a marriage with a 91% accuracy. This has been reprinted in many ways. You know, the book was entitled, for example, Fighting for Your Marriage, and there was Lasting Promise, which was the Christian view of fighting for your marriage. And I know that Gary Smalley has talked about it as being the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And it really gets down to the ones you just talked about. Either escalation, it starts out with a fight about socks on the floor and escalates into an inability to resolve the conflict. Invalidation, where somebody has a real concern about an issue, but the other spouse invalidates that. Oh, that's just your problem. It's not a big issue. Negative interpretation, where you say, you know, I just don't know if we can afford to go home at Thanksgiving to be with your family. And the response is, I knew you never liked my family, kind of always having a negative interpretation. Or the one that you just talked about, withdrawal and avoidance. We're not going to talk about these issues. And couples that choose to work through these 4 problems, which some people call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the ones that lead to marriages falling apart, are those that have successful marriages. And individuals that cannot work through that oftentimes have major problems in their marriage. And it gets back to the kind of the theme of your book of Team Us, doesn't it?
I think so. And I think that we talked earlier about how it's so easy to come to marriage with this idea of me. What am I going to get out of it? How's it going to make me happy? And we expect that it's going to make me happy. But if we can come to marriage with this idea that, you know what, we are going to have moments in our marriage where we're going to feel uncomfortable and we're going to feel unhappy. But in those moments, if we choose to react in the right way, even if we don't feel like it, which is really hard, especially I think for, you know, women like me, you know, because we're so emotional. I think if we can come into marriage with this realistic expectation that we will hit, you know, things that you have mentioned, and that we can get through them if we stick it out, I think that makes a huge difference, is just knowing that marriage is like a good story. It's an up and down, you know, up and down. There's plot twists, there's hard things, but you don't, you know, we don't give up reading a really good, gripping story because the character all of a sudden hits a hard spot, right. And we shouldn't do that with our marriages either.
I would certainly agree. Team Us, a forward, by the way, by Gary Chapman, and he's been on the program with us before, and we'll certainly have him on in the future. You have a chapter talking about a lighthearted marriage. We've talked about some heavy things, so it probably would be good to lighten it up a little bit here, but obviously I love what Ted says. Scandals, fiascos, yes, dear reader, this is our life together. So you've learned to laugh at some of the things that happen in your life.
We have, and I think that, you know, it's funny because Ted actually wrote his master's thesis on laughter, so that's probably helped us too.
I guess.
And he's very good at kind of bringing up the, you know, pointing to the funniness of a situation. Mm-hmm. And for us, I think that one reason that we've really been able to laugh through the hard things and keep that kind of lightheartedness in our marriage is because we try very hard not to hold grudges. You know, when we I talk about how we went on our honeymoon and we forgot to pack a camera, so we went to a store on the way to the airport and quickly picked out a camera, and it ended up being this, like, 110 camera, which took horrible pictures. That's not what you want to take to Paris with you. And we came home and we found out it took horrible pictures. And that was a great opportunity for us to look at each other and say, that was your fault. Who picked that out? And really let, you know, just this camera and bad pictures create this source of contention that really could have gone on for years. But instead, we decided to laugh about it and let it go. And I think that the more, couples really try to let things go, and it goes back to us talking about, okay, what are the things really worth getting upset about? When you choose to let go things that really aren't worth getting upset about, it makes it so much easier to have that lightheartedness in your marriage and be able to laugh with each other. And I think that's something that really helps, for us, it's helped carry us through difficult times.
Yeah. Don't hold grudges, and some people have long memories, but those sometimes don't serve you very well in some of those circumstances. So, again, just some great insight in the book, and certainly the Paris honeymoon camera fiasco is one of those that you will read about in the book, and I think we've done a good job here. What about this idea of analysis paralysis? Ted talks about this, the paradox of choice. It's known by many names, this inability to commit to something when there are so many options, so many opportunities to reject, and the consequences are so great. I appreciated Ashleigh's support as the right option slowly came into focus. That is a problem because I will make the argument, Ashleigh, since I am much older, probably the oldest one around the table here today, to recognize how that has created a problem. We have overchoice. If you don't think so, walk down a cereal aisle in a grocery store. If you don't think so, go into Fry's or Radio Shack and try to pick out an electronic piece of equipment. Obviously, if I had a little experience picking out a camera and recognizing that oftentimes this overchoice is a problem, and we are confronted with more choices than ever before, and that can really be a problem as well in marriage that at least Ted was talking about.
Right. What happened was it was about a year and a half into our marriage, and he ended up being laid off on his job. The job, basically the office was relocating, and the financial benefits of relocating were not enough for us to go with them. And he is a loyal to the end employee, so he just kind of ignored the inevitable that was going to happen until it actually happened. Sure. And when it did, he froze. And I think some of that was that he has a lot of talents. I mean, I consider him very much a Renaissance man. He can do a lot of different things, and that made it really hard for him to figure out in the shock of, not having a job anymore and suddenly having, now he had a wife and a daughter that he had to support. Okay, what do I do next? And having so many options of possibilities of paths he could, pursue, he just kind of froze. And I do think it's interesting. Ted worked in singles ministry for a while, and he said that he thought that was even an issue, specifically for guys as they think about going into marriage. Well, there are so many options out there. How can I just pick one? Let me just freeze and, see all my options. So I think that it's an issue that specifically maybe men have before marriage, and then, after marriage, just when they're faced with a lot of choices.
Well, and I think, again, we're dealing with the job, and of course, even before that, but I wanted to broaden it to all of our listeners. I mean, there are choices that are families even making right now about school, about houses, sometimes buying cars and equipment and all sorts of things. Some of these are major life choices, not the least of which is, who do you marry? Which job do I take? Do I buy a house? Maybe the largest purchase you'll ever make. Those are all difficult decisions. And it is absolutely essential that that's one place where Team Us better work together. Because if one spouse thinks this is going to be the ideal house and the other one has reservations, that's not going to work very well. If one spouse is convinced that this is the job of his or her dreams and the other spouse is saying, not so sure about this, I don't want to relocate, or I don't really think that's the job for you, that creates an enormous amount of tension within the marriage, doesn't it?
It does, and I think that really comes out when you are growing together. You're being intentional to grow together, and I do want to say, in all these decisions, it's best to band together and go to the Lord and say, okay, God, what do you want us to do? Give us wisdom. But when you are growing together on a consistent basis, I think you're also going to understand your spouse better and how they tick when you get into these type of situations where there are a lot of choices and you can't agree. And then when you do know your spouse better, I think you can trust them. Like you can trust their perceptions and what they're saying in the situation, and maybe accept it better. I don't know how to say that. I'm not sure how to communicate that really well, but we had a situation where I know that Ted, when it comes to decisions, and I think this is evident in the fact that he froze when it was time to find a new job, he's very deliberate. He takes a lot of time to make big decisions. Whereas I'm the kind of person who is like, no, let's just make a decision and be done with it.
Yeah.
But I knew that about him. So we have had a few instances in our marriage where he has made a decision very quickly. And you mentioned, like, buying a house. We had an instance where we looked at a house, and I wasn't crazy about the house, but he called me an hour later and said, let's buy it. And I said, okay, because I knew it must have been God, because he normally did not make decisions quick. And that's because I know him.
We'll come back and talk more about that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Ashleigh Slater with us for a few more minutes as we talk about her book, Team Us, Marriage Together. You know, Ashleigh, as we've talked about some of these challenges, you faced miscarriages, multiple layoffs, relocations, financial problems. There are a lot of things that can come into a marriage that can divide you, split you apart. And so it really is key to really holding on to that idea of teamwork in the midst of some of those challenges.
It is. And we found when we hit all of those things within basically a 2-year time period, so it was very intense, that we needed to band together. And we needed to, as we talked about grace earlier, we needed to be very intentional about exercising grace towards each other. Because I think just in general, you know, I mean, personalities aside, men and women tend to approach loss and grief, a little differently because we think differently. And so I think we had to go into these multiple losses and these multiple griefs because I took the miscarriage, I think, harder than Ted did. I mean, he grieved it. That's not to say he didn't, but he took the job loss harder than I did. And so in those moments when one of us was just feeling it more intensely, the other one had to really have grace and not try to push or force the other person to work through it too quickly, but just walk alongside them and have patience. And I think that that's a big thing to realize as couples when we go through difficult seasons is that you are an us, but you are also two different personalities, and you are going to deal with things a little differently. And, let your spouse deal with it as they need to and give them grace and support them, as long as it's not in a way that's ripping you apart as a couple. And so for us, we really found that we had to band together. And even beyond that, we had to really rely on God, and we had to rely on our church community. Those things were huge also.
Well, and one of the places where you see differences is in parenting. In your chapter on the parent trap, you quote from Bill Cosby, the only people who are always sure about the proper way to raise children, those who have never had any. And if divisions in a marriage can develop because of differences that you have about the marriage, they really for sure will surface later on in terms of parenting, because we bring into a marriage relationship the parenting skills and patterns that we had when we grew up. And so we bring in to the new marriage some of the patterns from the marriage, really kind of our family of origin. And so that's another place where we really need to work on parenting as a team.
Yes, and Ted and I found that we really brought very different upbringings and very different personalities to our parenting. And, we are that firstborn girl, lastborn boy combination, which is supposed to be really good for marriage. And it has been for our marriage, but when it's come to our parenting, we've really had to focus on not letting those things divide us, because I'm very structured, very schedule-oriented, and he's very like, ooh, okay, let's do this. Let's not worry about the clock. Let's not worry about the time. And we have really, it's been lots of opportunities for us to butt heads because we approach things so differently. And so I have really had to learn to step back and realize that just because my parents did something a certain way and I think it's the way we should do it with our kids doesn't necessarily mean that that is the right way. There may be other ways to do it, and maybe the way Ted wants to do it is a right way too. And how can I be open to his ideas and preferences and appreciate and accept them, and him with me. So we have really had to learn to be flexible and not hold on as tightly as we would like to, the way maybe our family did it.
Very good. Just before we ran out of time, you also talk about friendships, and that is something that I suspect most people would not have thought about, but you really think and believe that it is important for couples to consider with some kind of biblical wisdom the friendships that they have.
Yes, and I'm specifically talking about those close friends, those friends that you would be most likely to call up or have coffee with and say, you know what, my husband and I aren't getting along right now. The ones that you would go to for advice and wisdom on your marriage. And I think that as adults, we often think, you know what, I am past that, teenage phase of being influenced by my friends. But the truth is, we all are still influenced by the things that we allow, to feed us information. And so I think it's really important that those friends that you confide in and you trust with, information about your marriage are people that, one, they esteem marriage, they think highly of marriage, and they're not going to be quick to say, well, he's a jerk, I think you should leave him. They're not going to be, you don't want to confide in those kind of friends. They also are going to have respect for the opposite sex. I think it's very important that the friends that I confide in don't hate men, Because if they hate men, they're naturally going to think, and hate is a strong word, that they don't think poorly of men, that they don't think they're all jerks. You know, if I confide in another woman who thinks that, she's not going to automatically think positively of Ted. She's going to say, well, he's a man, and of course he would do that. And 3, I think it's really important that those close friends are friends that are not just going to feed my ego. You know, if I come to them and say, Ted and I had this conflict, I'm not sure what to do about it, they're going to be like, well, you know what, I'm sorry that's going on, but let's look at maybe your part in it, and how could you have done better, or how can you make this better with Ted? And I think that when we surround ourselves with friends, close friends, that are going to positively impact us when it comes to our marriages are going to do better.
Wow. Just about out of time, but I did want to mention your website, and it is a way in which people can connect up with you, Ashleigh Slater, and if they don't know how to spell it, it's on our website. You just click through. Of course, they can also find it through the video that we've posted there, a nice little cartoon description, and then you can see some of the other videos. But just before we let you go, Ashleigh, talk about what is available on your website so that people might want to get a copy of the book. There's a way they can win the book, and they can also follow you in terms of the writing that you've been doing.
Right. If they go to ashleighslater.com, they're going to be able to find out about the book. They're going to be able to read a lot of my recent articles because I write for several blogs on the topic of marriage. I also have both on ashleighslater.com and marriagetogether.com, which is also focuses on the book. I have a fun little quiz that they can take. They can see, you know, what TV couple are me and my spouse most like. And so that's just kind of a fun way to see, okay, what is our teamwork? Which TV couple is our teamwork most like? And there's a free printable. So just a lot of fun stuff on those 2 sites.
Very good. Ashleigh, thank you for being with us today. Again, the book, Team Us, Marriage Together. It is a book published by Moody. You can look for it in your local bookstore, but probably the best way is just to simply go to her website. Over 160 pages of great insights that will help your marriage grow strong and help you to understand what it means to be a team. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much.
Let's take a break, and we will come back tomorrow and get into some other issues. But just before we do so, let's talk about some of the resources that we've made available to you today. Interviews from the various books are always on the website, so you can go to our articles section and find that. We have videos that go with those books as well, and, of course, web links. So I hope that you will always take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. For those of you that have not done so, let me mention one more time that we do provide a service to you, and it is called Show Threads. And what we do is every day before the program, we actually send to you all the web links that we will post on the website. That gives you, obviously, all sorts of connections to the various books, the videos, and other resources so that you're aware of it before the program. If you can't listen to the program, and I know you probably are a busy person, you can then go back and listen to it later by following those links. Or if you heard part of the program and said, now, what was that person's name? What was that book that they mentioned again? It's already in your inbox. And so we make that available to you, and I hope that you will take the time to sign up for Show Threads. You can do it very quickly by going to our website, pointofview.net. The left-hand corner is entitled Get Involved. Click on that button. Then it will open up all sorts of things. You can check the box and receive my daily commentary that we send out free of charge. You can click on that box and check that box that gives you Show Threads, and there are all sorts of other ways in which you can connect up with us. So please take the time, if you have not connected with us, to do so. It's available at our website, pointofview.net. You can follow us on Facebook. You can also download a podcast. You can go to our YouTube channel. There are just lots of resources, so visit the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
You have been listening to Point of View. For materials offered on the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.